I remember that morning like it was a memory stitched into my skin. The air along the Blue Ridge Parkway was thin and crisp, the kind of October morning that carries the scent of decaying leaves and wet stone. My friend and I had set out early, hoping to find a trail less traveled, places that weren't on the map or mentioned in any guidebook. Most hikers stick to the well-worn paths, but we were curious for something deeper, something untouched. It wasn't long before we found it, a fissure in the rock face, half hidden by moss and fallen leaves, so narrow that it seemed almost like the earth itself was trying to hide it. Something about it called to me, the sort of pull that makes your stomach tighten and your pulse quicken. Crawling through that narrow opening was like stepping into another world. The air was thick, damp, and heavy with a musty scent of earth, almost like the mountain itself was breathing. Light fell off quickly, and soon our flashlights became more of a reassurance than a guide. Every step echoed back at us, stretched and distorted, as if the cavern itself was listening. I could hear my friend's quiet breathing ahead, uneven and nervous. The deeper we went, the darker it became, until our flashlights barely lit the walls that seemed to close in on us from all sides. And then I heard it, a faint tapping, irregular and soft, echoing from somewhere just beyond our view. I stopped in my tracks, my breath catching. My friend whispered something about water dripping, but the rhythm didn't match the slow, uneven trickle of any stream we'd ever heard. It had a deliberateness, a patience, like someone or something was moving in the shadows just beyond reach. We froze. My instincts screamed that we shouldn't be here, that whatever was in the dark didn't belong in the sunlight. I could feel it watching, or maybe listening, the silence stretching into something that pressed against my ears and chest. A gust of cold air brushed past me, carrying a damp, earthy smell, stronger than before, and I could almost make out shapes moving in the faint light. Shapes crouched low to the ground, impossibly still, disappearing whenever I blinked. And then, clear as the wind whistling through the trees above, came the whisper, a single word, drawn out and almost human, though I couldn't understand it. My heart thumped violently. I turned to my friend, eyes wide, and he gave me that forced, shaky grin that doesn't convince anyone, least of all yourself. Panic set in, cold and sharp. Every nerve in my body screamed to get out, to climb back through that tiny fissure into sunlight, into safety. I stumbled forward, dragging my friend with me, feet slipping on the wet stone. Behind us, the echo of the whisper, or perhaps multiple whispers now, traveled through the cave, weaving around us and making it impossible to tell if it was one voice or many. My flashlight caught a glimpse of it then, a crouched shape, hunched low, impossibly still, pressed against the wall like it was part of the rock. I blinked and it was gone, leaving only the echo of something that didn't belong in the world we knew. We scrambled, hands scraping against sharp edges, knees hitting the rough stone. My lungs burned, my chest heaving, but I couldn't stop thinking about the shadow, about those whispers that seemed to seep into my bones. When we finally broke through to the forest floor, the sunlight felt like salvation, blinding and warm in a way that made me ache from relief. But even as I gasped for breath, the memory of the cave remained stubbornly etched in my mind. That crouched figure, the whisper, the feeling of being watched, it didn't leave me once I was back on the trail. I couldn't explain what we had encountered. There was no evidence, no footprint, nothing to prove that we weren't imagining it in the darkness. But every time I close my eyes I see it crouched there, just at the edge of the light, waiting, patient. And sometimes, when the wind shifts through the trees along the parkway, I swear I hear that whisper again, a low, deliberate sound, just at the edge of hearing, and I feel my chest tighten the way it did that morning, when the world beyond the fissure still existed and the dark seemed alive. Even now, I hesitate to walk that section of the park alone. It's not the darkness or the cold, or even the sense of isolation that unnerves me. It's the certainty that whatever we saw, whatever whispered in the shadows, is still there waiting. Waiting for someone to crawl through the fissure again, to hear the tap of footsteps behind a curtain of stone, to feel that brush of air that carries a presence not meant for the daylight. And the strangest part is the lingering doubt that maybe, just maybe, it was waiting for us before we even found it, crouched and patient, watching from the dark, knowing exactly what we would do. I tell myself it was fear, the mind playing tricks in an unfamiliar cave. I tell myself that every shadow was a trick of the light, every whisper a reflection of our own breathing. But deep down, I know that I heard it. I felt it. And sometimes, when the night presses in and the wind moves through the hills, I swear I can hear it again, that single haunting word, carried up from the hidden cavern, reminding me that some places aren't meant to be found, and some things aren't meant to be seen. I'll never forget that morning. I'll never forget the smell of damp stone and decay, the echo of my own footsteps, the faint tap of something moving just beyond reach. And I'll never forget the crouched figure, impossibly still, and the whisper that will forever follow me whenever I venture too close to the forgotten corners of the Blue Ridge Parkway. The memory is sharp, unrelenting, and even now, decades later, I feel that pull, an almost magnetic tug toward the fissure, toward the darkness, where the echoes still linger, patient and alive. I'd heard whispers about the Limestone cave from a local at the general store, a man whose face was weathered by wind and sun, and whose eyes seemed to hold more knowledge of the mountains than any map could show. He told me most people avoided it, said it was too easy to get lost, too quiet in a way that made the mind wander into places it shouldn't. I didn't care. Curiosity is a dangerous thing, but it's hard to resist, especially in the quiet stretches of the parkway where the trees seem to lean close and the wind carries secrets. So I set out early, the air damp with fog and the smell of wet leaves pressing against my boots. I found the entrance not far from the road, almost completely swallowed by overgrowth. A thin crack in the hillside, barely more than a seam in the stone, beckoned me. I hesitated only for a moment, then crawled in, flashlight in hand, and let the earth swallow me. Inside, the cave was nothing like I expected. The walls were slick with moisture, the floor uneven and treacherous, forcing me to move slowly and carefully. The air felt thick, almost viscous, carrying the earthy tang of limestone and something older, something that made my skin prickle. My flashlight cut a narrow line of clarity through the black, but beyond that, the darkness was dense, almost physical. I had to rely on touch more than sight, running my hands along the rock, feeling its cold, damp surface, testing each step before trusting it. Minutes or hours passed. Time lost all meaning. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. Not just quiet, but the kind of silence that presses against your ears, filling them until you can hear your own heartbeat and nothing else. And then I noticed the scratchings on the walls. At first, I thought they were natural fissures, old weathering patterns in the limestone, but the closer I looked, the more I realized they were deliberate. Sharp lines, repeated, scratched in a rhythm that felt deliberate, almost like writing. I traced one with my finger, and the rock vibrated faintly beneath my touch, so subtly that I could have convinced myself it was imagination. But it wasn't. It was real. There was a presence here, something patient and watching. From the corner of my eye, I caught movement. Something shifted just beyond the range of my flashlight. Not an animal, not anything I could name, and certainly not anything human. My stomach clenched and my breath quickened. I tried to convince myself it was my mind, the stress of the cave's oppressive darkness playing tricks. But then I heard it, a low, steady breathing, slow and even, in rhythm with my own. My pulse hammered in my ears, and I stumbled backward, almost tripping over a jagged rock. Panic rose, cold and insistent. Every instinct screamed at me to move, to leave, but the path back seemed to stretch endlessly before me, the walls closing in as if the cave itself were alive, reshaping in my fear. I ran. The rocks tore at my hands and knees, my flashlight bobbing wildly, illuminating glimpses of the dark. Shadows shifted and pooled in the corners, lingering where the light fell briefly before retreating again. It was impossible to tell if they were moving toward me or simply responding to my frantic movement, and that uncertainty was worse than anything else. I could hear the low breathing behind me, too consistent, too deliberate to be natural. I stumbled again, scraping my hands raw on the limestone, feeling the sting of blood mingled with the damp smell of the cave. My lungs burned, my chest heaving as I fought to keep moving, dragging myself toward the faint glimmer of daylight I remembered seeing when I first entered. When I finally reached the cave's mouth, the relief was immediate and visceral. Sunlight flooded my eyes, warm and almost too bright, and I staggered onto the leaf-strewn ground outside. I gasped for air, heart hammering in my chest, and looked back once. The shadows inside didn't retreat. They lingered, not moving but present, an impossibility that settled deep in my stomach. I didn't linger. I turned and ran, leaving the mouth of the cave behind, but I could still feel the weight of it, pressing against my back, as if it had followed me out in some invisible way. That night I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the scratchings on the walls, the subtle, impossible vibrations under my touch, and I heard the slow, steady breathing that had matched my own. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe the cave was old, full of natural shifts and sounds amplified by the limestone's acoustics. But my mind kept circling back to the figure, the presence I couldn't name, that lingered just out of sight. It felt patient, knowing, as if it had been waiting for someone curious enough to follow the fissure into its depths. Weeks later, I returned to the general store, hoping for guidance, for confirmation that someone else knew what I had felt. The old man looked at me, eyes narrowing, and said nothing about the cave. Just shook his head and muttered, "Some places ain't meant to be seen." That was it. No warnings, no stories. Just an acknowledgement that what I had encountered was beyond casual explanation. I've never been back to the cave, but I think about it often. I think about the rhythm of my own breathing, mirrored by something unseen. I think about the scratchings, so deliberate they seemed alive. I think about the shadows, patient and still, waiting in the darkness. And sometimes, when the wind whistles just right through the Blue Ridge, I hear that low, steady breathing again, and I remember that cave, the limestone walls, and the impossibility of truly leaving something behind that has chosen to follow. Even now, the memory presses on me, heavy and unshakable. It isn't fear that lingers, it's the certainty of what I cannot name, what I cannot see, what I know exists because I felt it, because the cave left a part of itself behind in my bones. Some encounters aren't about what you see. They're about what remains after, quiet and insistent, a shadow at the edge of your world that will never leave you alone. I had heard about the Blue Grotto from a hiker I ran into on the parkway, a place locals whispered about as a quiet refuge, a hidden gem tucked between the hills where the sun filtered down in fractured beams and the water ran clear and cold. I thought it was just that, a serene spot to sit and watch the reflections ripple across the stone, maybe breathe a little easier in the quiet of the mountains. The early morning fog still clung to the trees when I set out, the kind of damp mist that hangs on your jacket and settles in your hair, and the parkway was nearly empty except for the occasional rustle of wildlife. Finding the entrance wasn't difficult. It was a narrow gap in the rocks, half hidden by overgrown ferns and moss, the kind of place you might pass a dozen times and never notice. I stepped in carefully, feeling the cool air brush against my face, and at first it was just as I imagined. Still, peaceful, almost sacred. The deeper I went, the colder the air became. It was more than the shade or the damp stone. It was a chill that seemed to press against my chest and seep into my bones. The trickle of water from somewhere above began to grow more distinct, and I realized it wasn't just a trickle. At times it sounded like faint chanting, low and rhythmic, as if the stones themselves were murmuring something just beyond understanding. I laughed quietly to myself, trying to brush off the unease, thinking it was the acoustics of the grotto playing tricks on my mind. But then I noticed the whispers, soft at first, just beyond the edge of my hearing. I paused, straining to make out the words. They weren't random. Each syllable carried urgency, insistence, repeating a word I couldn't comprehend. My stomach tightened and a wave of panic began to creep in, but a part of me wanted to go further, to understand, to see if the sounds meant anything at all. I stepped forward, careful not to slip on the wet rock, and the whispers seemed to follow, growing clearer in rhythm and tone. I could feel the darkness pressing around me, more alive than I had ever imagined. Then there was a splash behind me, sharp and wet, echoing across the walls. I whipped around, heart hammering, flashlight cutting a narrow line through the gloom, but there was nothing, only the faint outline of movement against the dripping stone, disappearing before my eyes could fully catch it. My pulse raced, every nerve in my body alert. I took another step, and a second splash came from the same direction, a beat behind the first, deliberate and slow. The flashlight flickered, sputtering once, twice, and in that brief darkness, I felt it, breath warm and moist against the back of my neck. My entire body froze, a cold sweat breaking across my skin. I couldn't see anything, but the sensation was as real as the stone beneath my hands. My instincts screamed at me to run, to get out of there before whatever it was could make itself known. I spun around, the light catching nothing, and stumbled over the uneven floor. My shoes slipped on the wet stone, my hands scraping against the rough walls as I scrambled toward the entrance I had come through, praying it would still be there. The whispers followed me, soft and insistent, threading into my own breathing, wrapping around my thoughts. Each step felt heavier, the walls seeming to close in just enough to make my progress slow, and I was acutely aware of every sound. The drip of water, the scuff of my shoes, my own ragged exhale. When the entrance finally appeared, the sight of daylight was like a punch to the chest, and I lunged for it, arms outstretched, falling onto the leaf-strewn trail outside. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat, my hands trembling as I pushed myself to stand. The sun, filtered through the morning fog, felt impossibly bright, warm, and ordinary, and for a moment I allowed myself to believe it was over. But even as I moved down the trail, away from the grotto, the whispers didn't fade. They followed me in subtle ways, curling around the edges of my thoughts, echoing faintly in the spaces between footsteps. I tried to shake them, tried to convince myself it had been acoustics, nerves, exhaustion, but the feeling of breath against my neck, the deliberate rhythm in the splashes, the urgency in the whispers, all of it refused to leave me. Every time I closed my eyes that night, I could see the wet walls glistening in my flashlight's narrow beam, and hear that same word, the one I couldn't understand, repeated over and over in the dark. Sleep was a fragile thing that night, broken by dreams of dripping water and shadowed forms, moving just out of reach. I woke in a cold sweat several times, each time certain I could still feel a presence lingering somewhere, patient and waiting. It wasn't a fear of death or violence. It was a quiet, pressing dread, the sort that burrows into the marrow and refuses to let go. I realized the grotto had left something inside me, a sense that some places carry a memory, a consciousness, and that even when you step out into sunlight, you are never truly free from it. I've been back to the parkway many times since, often passing near the grotto, and every time a shiver runs down my spine. I avoid the gap in the rocks now, telling myself it's better to leave well enough alone, that curiosity is a dangerous thing. But sometimes, in the still of early morning, when the mist hangs low and the forest is silent except for the wind and the trickle of water from the hills, I hear it. A faint whisper, urgent and repeating, threading through the quiet, and I know that the blue grotto is still there waiting for someone curious enough to step inside again, to hear the chanting of the stones, to feel the breath against their neck, to understand, too late, that some places should never be disturbed. I found the old map folded carefully inside a leather journal at a second-hand bookstore, the kind of place where the air smells of mildew and paper, and the shelves lean with the weight of decades. The map was crude, hand-drawn, marking a small section of the Blue Ridge Parkway with a tunnel I'd never heard of. According to the notes scrawled in the margins, it had been collapsed for years, avoided by locals who whispered about strange noises, inexplicable disappearances, and the sense of being watched. I'd always been drawn to these forgotten places, and despite the warnings, curiosity won. Early one morning, I drove the winding roads before sunrise, the fog clinging low to the forest, and parked near the spot the map indicated. The entrance was small, almost imperceptible, a thin gap at the base of the hillside, partially blocked by fallen rocks and undergrowth. My hands shook as I pried it open, the metal scraping against stone, and I felt the first thrill of unease as I stepped into the blackness. Immediately, the air inside was thick and cold, smelling of damp earth and something else I couldn't name, something that made my skin crawl. My flashlight illuminated only a few feet in front of me, the walls slick with condensation, the floor uneven and treacherous. Every step echoed unnaturally, the sound bouncing back with a delay that made my stomach lurch and my head spin. I tried to slow my breathing, to focus on the concrete, the stones beneath my feet, the faint glimmer of mineral deposits, but the echoes twisted everything, making it feel as if I was walking in a chamber much larger, much older than reality. Then I heard it. The shuffling. Soft at first, almost imperceptible but distinct. My heart hitched. I froze, listening, straining to catch the source. Each shuffle came closer, slow and deliberate, yet every time I turned my flashlight toward it, there was nothing. My pulse pounded as the sounds continued, echoing against the walls, a rhythm that mirrored my own panicked heartbeat. I moved forward carefully, hand tracing the damp rock, and that's when I noticed the handprints. Faint at first, but unmistakable, pressed into the limestone as if someone, or something, had crawled along the walls. My fingers brushed one, and I swear I felt it move under my touch, like the stone itself was breathing. A cold shiver ran through me, but a stubborn curiosity forced me further inside. Minutes, or maybe hours, passed. Time felt suspended, warped by the oppressive darkness and the weight of isolation. The shuffling never stopped, always just beyond my sight. My flashlight flickered, throwing strange angles of light that made the handprints seem alive, reaching toward me, dragging along the walls. I imagined figures pressed in the shadows, crouched and waiting, watching as I inched forward, powerless to look away. My imagination whispered explanations, trying to tell me it was my own fear, but there was something in the rhythm of the sounds, in the shifting shadows, that defied rational thought. At one point, I paused to catch my breath, leaning against the cold wall, and I noticed that the tunnel ahead narrowed even more, the ceiling lower, the darkness absolute. Every step forward felt like trespassing deeper into a place that wanted to be left alone. And then I felt it, a pressure, almost a presence, heavy and patient, pressing against the back of my mind. My pulse spiked, and instinct screamed at me to retreat, to turn around and run for the daylight I remembered at the entrance. I ran, scrambling over sharp rocks, my hands bleeding from the rough limestone, my knees catching on uneven edges. The echoes followed me, twisting and bouncing in ways that made it impossible to judge distance or direction. Shadows seemed to stretch and recoil, keeping pace with me even as I moved faster. I caught glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, just enough to make my stomach tighten, but when I spun around, nothing was there. My chest heaved, every breath shallow and ragged, my flashlight bobbing wildly, illuminating only the black stone around me. Finally, the faint glimmer of daylight appeared ahead, alien and blinding after the oppressive darkness. I stumbled into it, nearly falling onto the leaf-strewn ground outside. The sunlight felt wrong, too bright, too warm, too ordinary, and I gasped, my lungs screaming for air, my body shaking with relief and lingering terror. I looked back once at the tunnel, expecting to see nothing but stone and shadows, but even from outside, the darkness seemed alive. It lingered, patient, unblinking, as if the tunnel itself had been watching, waiting for someone to emerge and carry a part of it out into the world. Even days later, the experience haunted me. At night, I imagined shadows at the edge of my vision, crouched and patient. I could feel the cold, damp pressure in my bones, hear the echoing shuffles and whispers, and imagine the handprints crawling along walls that didn't exist anymore. Sleep was uneasy. Every creak in the house or rustle outside felt like the tunnel reaching for me. I knew rationally that I had survived, that nothing had touched me physically, but the presence remained, a part of the place lodged in my memory, in my nerves, in my perception of light and dark. I've never returned to that part of the parkway, and I avoid the side paths, the overgrowth, the subtle hints of abandoned stone and earth. But sometimes, when the wind whistles through the hollows, or when the fog hugs the mountains early in the morning, I swear I hear the shuffling again. Not a creature, not an animal, but a rhythm, patient and deliberate, echoing through the air, reminding me that the tunnel exists beyond my sight, and that I carry a part of it with me. It is not malevolent in a traditional sense, but it is patient, and it is waiting for someone else to step inside and witness what it leaves behind in the dark. I spotted the crevice from the road as I drove along the parkway that late afternoon, a narrow gap in the rock face that most drivers would pass without a second glance. There was something about it, a subtle shift in shadow and texture that caught my eye, and I felt that familiar pull, an insistent curiosity that's hard to resist when you've spent years exploring these mountains. I parked the car and approached carefully, slipping through the tight opening with effort, scraping my arms and legs on the rough stone. The air inside was immediately cooler, damp and heavy with the smell of limestone and earth, carrying a faint musk that made my skin prickle. My flashlight revealed a chamber that seemed untouched, as if time itself had ignored it for decades. Stalactites hung from the ceiling, dripping steadily onto the floor, their rhythm oddly unsettling, like a slow pulse keeping time with the very heartbeat of the cave. I stepped further in, moving slowly, mindful of the uneven floor, when I noticed the piles of rocks. At first, I thought they were random accumulations, remnants of minor collapses or natural shifts, but the more I looked, the more deliberate they seemed. Arranged in lines and clusters, almost like markers or warnings, they gave me a strange, oppressive sense that someone, or something, had been here long before me. I could feel it pressing in, a weight in the air that made my stomach tighten and my shoulders stiffen. The light from my flashlight caught shadows pooling in the corners, shapes that my mind initially dismissed as tricks of the beam, but which seemed to shift when I blinked. They weren't moving in the way that animals move. They were still, but alive in some way I couldn't name, watching, waiting. And then the hum began, low and barely perceptible at first. I paused, straining to hear it, wondering if it was my imagination. But it grew, subtle at first, vibrating through my chest in a way that made the hair on my arms stand on end. I wanted to leave, to crawl back through the crevice into the sunlight and safety of the open air, but a part of me was compelled to move closer, to see what caused it, to understand why it resonated so deeply in the air around me. As I stepped forward, the gusts of cold air swept past, carrying a faint scent of smoke, though there was no fire, no ember, nothing to explain it. My chest tightened, and a shiver ran through me, but curiosity anchored me. The shadows in the corners deepened, pooling into shapes that seemed almost deliberate. It was impossible to tell if they were figures crouched in the darkness or merely illusions, but the sense of being observed was undeniable. Each step I took caused the rocks to shift slightly, the air to hum a little louder, and the silence to thrum with tension. I felt exposed, though no one else was present, or at least no one I could see. I imagined that if I turned my back for too long, something might reach out from the shadows and touch me, and the thought made my pulse accelerate. Suddenly, a small pile of stones near the center of the chamber shifted, as though displaced by an invisible hand. My heart thumped violently. I wanted to call out to remind myself that it was just the wind, just the echo of my own steps, but my voice caught in my throat. The hum rose in pitch slightly, vibrating through the air, pressing against my eardrums and chest, and I stumbled backward, tripping over a jagged rock and landing hard on my knees. My palms scraped along the limestone, cold and wet, and the sensation of the stones under my hands was sharper somehow, almost aware, as if they had been waiting for me to touch them. Fear finally overpowered my curiosity. I scrambled to my feet and began moving toward the crevice, stumbling over the jagged rocks, heart racing, lungs burning. The shadows seemed to follow, creeping at the edges of my vision, just beyond the reach of the flashlight, and the hum persisted, low and insistent, as if resonating from the very walls themselves. Each step toward the exit felt longer than it should, as though the chamber stretched in defiance, refusing to let me leave without acknowledging its presence. I was frantic now, the chill in the air biting deeper, the scent of smoke stronger, more pervasive, lingering in my nostrils. When I finally emerged into the open air, the sunlight struck me like a shock. The world outside seemed unervingly bright, almost unreal after the oppressive darkness of the chamber. My lungs gulped at the warm air, my legs trembling as I stood on the leaf-strewn ground, trying to convince myself that it was over, that nothing had followed me. But even as I walked back to the parkway, the sense of being watched lingered, a residual pressure in the back of my mind that refused to release me. Every shadow at the edge of my vision made me tense, every rustle in the forest seemed amplified, as though echoing the unseen presence I had left behind. Days later, I would catch myself imagining shapes in corners, shadows in the room, subtle vibrations that weren't there. The memory of the chamber stayed vivid in my mind. The slow dripping of the stalactites, the hum that pressed against my chest, the piles of rocks that felt like markers or warnings, and the faint scent of smoke that suggested something alive yet untouchable. The fear wasn't a sharp, sudden terror. It was slow, insidious, a persistent unease that clung to me, reminding me that some places in the mountains hold on to those who enter them, leaving pieces behind that linger long after the sunlight feels familiar again. Even now, whenever I pass that section of the parkway, I find myself scanning the rocks, imagining crevices I shouldn't see, wondering if the chamber is still there, waiting for the next person curious or foolish enough to slip through its narrow opening. The memory is both terrifying and compelling, a quiet dread that is impossible to explain, yet impossible to forget, leaving me with a lingering question that haunts every return to those hills. What watches in the dark, and what is left behind when we are finally seen? I had been chasing quiet spots along the parkway for years, places the casual hiker would never notice, tucked away caves and hollows where the wind didn't carry ordinary sounds and the mountains seemed to hold their breath. That morning, the fog was low and wet, hanging in the trees like a heavy curtain, and the sun was just beginning to push through the mist. I parked near a narrow trailhead, following the directions I'd pieced together from an old guide and whispered advice from a local who warned me to leave well enough alone. The cave itself was unremarkable from the outside, a black slit in the rock face partially hidden by ferns and fallen limbs. But there was a pull to it, a gravity that made me lean forward before I even realized I was stepping toward the opening. The air at the entrance was already cool, carrying the scent of limestone and something older, something like the mountains themselves exhaling in the early morning. I squeezed through the narrow opening, flashlight in hand, and immediately the world shifted. The light barely cut through the darkness, illuminating rough, damp walls that felt closer than they should have been. The air was thick and heavy, pressing against my lungs, and the silence hit me like a wall. Not the kind of silence you find on a quiet trail, but a deep, absolute silence, the kind that swallows your own movements and leaves only your heartbeat echoing in your ears. Every footstep I took seemed to disappear into the stone, or maybe it was delayed, returning to me in distorted pulses that made my stomach lurch. I paused to listen, trying to orient myself, and that's when I heard it, the faintest sound of footsteps behind me. Soft, deliberate, echoing my own rhythm. I froze. My pulse accelerated as I spun, flashlight swinging wildly, but there was nothing. Just the empty black, the walls pressing in. I tried to rationalize it, an echo, the stone playing tricks, but the steps didn't stop. They matched my pace, falling a beat behind or beside me, and then multiplied. Suddenly, there were too many to count, coming from every direction at once, echoing off the walls, off the ceiling, merging and splitting in impossible ways. My stomach dropped, and panic set in with a cold, insistent weight. I turned and ran blindly, stumbling over uneven stone, my flashlight bobbing in my trembling hand. Shapes flickered at the edge of the light, quick, impossible shadows darting along the walls, vanishing before I could focus on them. The air grew colder, pressing against me from all sides, and I felt disoriented, as if the cave itself were reshaping, twisting to keep me inside. Every turn seemed the same, every passage identical, and the steps never stopped. They were patient, waiting, deliberate, echoing in ways that made me question whether the cave had a rhythm of its own. My lungs burned, my knees scraped against jagged stone, and my heart hammered so loudly I thought it might betray me entirely. I screamed at the darkness, my voice swallowed immediately, as if the cave rejected it. The footsteps didn't answer, but they didn't pause either, following me relentlessly, impossibly, from places I couldn't see. Finally, after what felt like hours but could only have been minutes, I spotted a faint gleam of daylight at the far end of the passage. Relief surged, a strange, desperate hope that the world outside still existed, still offered air and light. I lunged toward it, hands scraping along the walls, feet slipping on wet stone, and emerged into the morning, coughing, shivering, heart hammering. The sunlight felt alien, too bright, too warm, almost painfully ordinary after the suffocating darkness. I staggered down the trail, barely able to catch my breath, yet the footsteps remained. Not audible in the open air, but a pressure in my chest, a phantom echo that seemed to follow me as if the cave had released something along with me. Hours later, I could still feel it, the rhythm of steps trailing me when I paused, the sense of unseen eyes pressed against the back of my neck. Shadows at the edge of my vision seemed too solid, too deliberate to be imagined. I tried to shake it, to convince myself that it was adrenaline, fear, and a trick of the mountains, but the memory of those steps, their patience and inevitability, refused to leave me. I couldn't tell if it had been a presence in the cave or something I carried out with me, embedded in my perception, a shadow that the sunlight could not chase away. Even now, I hesitate near narrow openings in the stone, near dark hollows in the forest. I hear the echo of those steps in quiet moments, in the hours just before dawn, and my skin prickles, my heart quickens. I know the cave is still there, patient, swallowing sound, watching, waiting for the next person to follow in my footsteps. The fear it leaves is not sudden or violent. It's the slow, insistent realization that some places leave part of themselves inside you, that some darknesses do not end when you emerge, and that even hours later, the echoes of what you encountered can reverberate in your bones long after the air has cleared and the light has returned. I came across the hollow by accident, taking a side trail off the parkway just as the sun was dipping below the ridges. The trees were dense here, their long shadows stretching across the forest floor, and the air carried that damp, earthy smell that always signals something hidden just out of sight. I almost passed it, just another dip in the ground, a dark seam in the rocks, but there it was, a small cave mouth tucked into the hillside, and inside, a faint lantern light flickering as if someone had been waiting. My curiosity wrestled with my instincts. I knew better than to follow lights in the woods at dusk, but something drew me forward, slow and deliberate, until I crouched at the entrance, peering inside. The lantern's light painted the walls in wavering gold, revealing carvings that I couldn't immediately comprehend. Strange symbols, looping and jagged, scratched deep into the stone, interspersed with short tally marks, the kind you'd imagine someone might use to count days, or people. My stomach tightened. The air inside was cool, unnaturally so, carrying the faintest metallic tang, and I could feel the space pressing around me, the shadows stretching into corners the light couldn't reach. Something about the movement of the flame itself was unsettling. It wasn't steady like a normal candle or lantern. It drifted slightly, as if carried, floating in the air without a hand, drifting closer with each hesitant step I took. My panic started to rise, a cold wave that sloshed through my veins, but I couldn't retreat quickly enough. Every instinct screamed at me to run, yet my feet felt leaden, and my eyes were locked on the small moving glow. It drifted toward me, teasing and insistent, hovering just beyond reach. I reached out, foolishly, almost expecting a hand to meet mine, but there was nothing. Just the cold air and the faint hum of something alive in the shadows. Then, without warning, the lantern went out. The light vanished completely, and I was plunged into darkness so absolute it pressed in on every side, swallowing the sound of my own frantic breathing. I scrambled backward, hands scraping along the damp walls, feeling for the uneven floor, heart hammering so loudly I was sure it would give me away. And then something brushed past my shoulder. Cold. Hard. Almost like a hand, fleeting, but tangible enough to make my blood run ice through my veins. I spun around, my flashlight illuminating only black stone, no shape, no explanation. My chest constricted, every nerve screaming to get me out, yet the hollow seemed to stretch impossibly before me, twisting with each desperate step. I stumbled, arms flailing, nearly losing my footing on wet, mossy rocks, and finally, after what felt like eternity, I burst from the mouth of the cave into the dimming twilight. Outside, the forest was quiet, too quiet, and the fading light made everything look unreal, unnervingly bright against the darkness I had left behind. My hands were trembling, and though the lantern was nowhere in sight, I could still feel the memory of it, of the drifting flame, of the tally marks on the walls, of the cold brush against my skin. I walked back to my car as quickly as my legs would carry me, my senses heightened, expecting movement in the periphery, expecting the air to press down against me again. Even hours later, in the safety of my room, the sensation lingered. When I closed my eyes, I could still see the lantern flickering just beyond reach, drifting toward me as if it had chosen me. And sometimes, just before sleep, I swear I feel that cold, faint hand pressing against mine, a ghostly reminder that some places keep pieces of those who enter, and they never truly let go. I had always been drawn to quiet corners of the parkway, spots where the road fell away and the forest pressed close, and that evening, the fading light seemed to pull me toward a shallow cave I'd passed countless times without noticing. The air was heavy with the scent of damp leaves and cold earth, and the last rays of sun were slipping behind the ridges, leaving the hollow in shadow. I told myself it would be a simple exploration, a quiet adventure, a place to watch the day fade into night without interruption. The entrance was small, partially hidden by moss and fallen branches, and as I crouched to peer inside, a strange sense of anticipation gripped me, tightening my chest and making each breath shallow. At first, it was silent, just the faint drip of water somewhere deeper in the stone, echoing lightly in the narrow chamber. Then I noticed the murmurs, soft and fragmented at first, almost like wind brushing across the hollow rather than voices. I froze, straining to listen, and slowly the words began to take shape. Not coherent sentences, but syllables and phrases that tugged at recognition, like a language on the edge of memory, half-formed and incomplete. It felt as if the cave itself were trying to speak, shaping its walls into a voice that I could just barely understand. The hairs on my arms prickled, my stomach knotted, and I instinctively took a step back, yet the murmurs drew me forward, insistent and persistent, tugging at the corners of my mind. As I leaned closer, the air thickened, carrying an unease that pressed in on my chest. The cave smelled of damp stone and something metallic, faint but unmistakable, a tang that made my mouth dry. The murmurs became clearer, syllables that I almost recognized, whispering just beyond comprehension. I wanted to retreat, to flee, but my curiosity anchored me, held me in place despite the rising panic. Then I saw them, faint silhouettes pressed against the walls, indistinct at first, mere shadows, but unmistakably watching. They didn't move, didn't breathe in a visible way, but their presence was undeniable, silent and patient. Panic surged. My instincts screamed at me to turn, to run, but the cave seemed to stretch in all directions, its narrow walls elongating in ways that made my exit feel impossibly far. I stumbled backward, my flashlight catching glimpses of the silhouettes darting at the periphery of my vision, fleeting and impossible to focus on fully. The murmurs rose in intensity, surrounding me, echoing from every angle, pressing into my thoughts until I could barely remember what had drawn me here in the first place. Every sense screamed danger, but it wasn't a scream of violence. It was quiet, deliberate, suffocating. The cave was alive in its own way, and it remembered me, every step, every breath I took inside its mouth. I scrambled toward the entrance, hands scraping against rough stone, heart hammering in my chest, lungs burning as the shadows seemed to drift along the walls, silent observers of my desperation. The murmurs lingered, following me, winding into my ears, threading through my thoughts even as I emerged into the cold night air. Outside, the forest was still, peaceful in contrast, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the cave's presence had imprinted itself on me. The shadows, the murmurs, the patient watching, all of it lingered in the corners of my mind, a memory that refused to fade. Since that night, I haven't returned to the hollow, and I avoid that stretch of the parkway whenever possible. Yet the memory remains vivid. The way the voices shaped themselves just beyond comprehension, the cold press of the air, the silhouettes blending with the stone, waiting and watching. Sometimes, in the quiet hours before sleep, I think I hear fragments of those murmurs again, just faint enough to remind me that the cave remembers me, and that I carry a part of it with me, no matter how far I travel from its shadowed mouth.